What happens when an HOA president decides she's above federal law? This isn't just another neighborhood dispute. It's the story of a woman who tried to control everything, from lawns and fences to the U.S. mail itself. When she ordered the post office to hand over every letter in her community, she had no idea who she was about to challenge. A calm, unshakable postmaster with the full weight of the law behind him. What started as a petty power trip turned into a federal lockdown, a criminal investigation, and one of the most satisfying takedowns of HOA tyranny ever caught on camera. Stay until the end, because justice doesn't just show up. It paints a yellow line around the mailbox as a permanent reminder that some boundaries are never meant to be crossed. This is when HOA power goes too far. The postmaster had enough. There's something almost hypnotic about a perfect neighborhood. The quiet rhythm of sprinklers at dawn, the hum of lawn mowers on Saturday mornings, the symmetry of mailboxes lined like soldiers. That's what drew Evan Cole to Birch Hollow Estates, a place where everything looked like it had been ironed flat by order itself. Maple trees framed the sidewalks, and every front porch seemed to smile in the same polite shade of beige. It was the kind of neighborhood that promised peace through predictability. But beneath that polished surface, power was quietly nesting. Power disguised as community standards. Evan didn't notice it right away. At first, the letters from the Homeowners Association felt harmless enough. A reminder here, a suggestion there. Please repaint your shutters to match the approved color palette. Your welcome mat exceeds the allowable dimensions. The tone was polite, but there was something cold in the precision of it, like the words had been measured with a ruler before being mailed. Still, Evan brushed it off. He was new. Maybe this was just how things worked here. Everyone wanted to keep the neighborhood nice, right? Then came the flags. His daughter had hung a small seasonal flag on the porch, a cheerful splash of orange leaves in October. The next morning, it was gone, replaced by a citation taped to his door. Unauthorized decorative display. Martha Denton, the HOA president, had signed it in bold, swooping ink. The kind of signature that didn't just approve things, it commanded them. People whispered her name like she was a weather pattern. Calm one day, storm the next. And in Birch Hollow, her rules weren't guidelines. They were gospel. Martha saw herself as the guardian of order. Uniformity, she'd often say at meetings, is what separates civilization from chaos. To her, chaos could be anything. A mismatched fence, a faded mailbox, or a kid's basketball hoop left out overnight. But what she really feared wasn't disorder. It was the idea of not being in control. That fear drove her to stretch her authority further each month, like an invisible fence expanding beyond the yards it was meant to protect. The neighbors had learned not to question it. When Martha wanted everyone's trash cans lined up at a perfect 45-degree angle, they complied. When she banned wind chimes because they were auditorily invasive, they stayed silent. Resistance only made her stronger, because compliance fed her illusion of perfection. Evan could see it now. The entire neighborhood had been trained to equate peace with obedience, and that realization unsettled him. He hadn't moved here for perfection. He'd moved here for home. It's strange how tyranny often hides behind politeness. It doesn't always come roaring through the gates. Sometimes it's written in cursive on official letterhead. Martha's memos began to sound less like reminders and more like warnings. Words like failure to comply and subject to fines crept into her vocabulary. Then, one afternoon, a rumor spread through the cul-de-sac like static. The HOA was planning to review all incoming mail for regulatory compliance. At first, people laughed. It sounded absurd. But when Martha herself confirmed it in an email, stating that certain deliveries and correspondence were undermining community values, the laughter stopped. Evan read that email 3 times, trying to make sense of it. Oversight of mail? That was beyond obsessive. It was invasive. The mail was personal, Letters, bills, packages, medical supplies, and yet Martha's message framed it as civic duty. "We are protecting the integrity of our neighborhood," she wrote. "Some residents have received non-compliant materials that negatively impact our reputation." She even called it a pilot program for community trust. That phrase clung to Evan's thoughts long after he closed his laptop. Community trust built on surveillance. How could anyone not see the irony? There's a point where control stops feeling like safety and starts feeling like suffocation. Evan began noticing subtle changes. The way neighbors avoided eye contact when she drove by. The way conversations fell silent at HOA meetings. Fear had replaced friendliness. Birch Hollow Estates looked the same, but it felt smaller, tighter, like someone had turned down the oxygen. And that's when Evan realized something powerful. The moment people stop questioning absurdity, absurdity becomes normal. Still, he wondered, what would it take to stop her? Not a complaint, not an argument. Those only fed her need for attention. No, it would take something bigger. Something that didn't bend to her paper-thin authority. Because no matter how much power Martha Denton thought she had, there were lines she couldn't cross. Lines drawn not by bylaws or neighborhood votes, but by law itself. It started like any other morning in Birch Hollow Estates, the kind that fools you into thinking life will follow the same gentle rhythm forever. The sky was washed in that soft, forgiving light that only exists before the day begins demanding things of you. Evan was sipping his coffee by the window when he noticed Martha Denton marching down the sidewalk, clipboard tucked under her arm like a badge of honor. She wasn't strolling. She was patrolling. That was her walk, the steady, purposeful stride of someone who believed the world worked better when she was in charge of it. At the community mail kiosk, she wasn't alone. A small group of neighbors had gathered, murmuring in confusion as Martha began setting up what looked like an impromptu command center. Large plastic bins, labeled incoming, outgoing, and non-compliant, sat neatly stacked beside her. She wore gloves, the kind doctors use, as though sorting mail were a surgical procedure. The sight would have been almost comical if it weren't so invasive. Evan could already feel the unease ripple across the group, that unspoken question, rising in the air. Can she actually do this? Moments later, the mail truck pulled up. Rosa Martinez, the regular postal carrier for Birch Hollow, stepped out with her usual warm smile, the kind of smile that makes you believe some people genuinely love their job. Rosa greeted Martha kindly, unaware she was walking into a storm. Martha, clipboard poised, didn't bother with small talk. "From today onward," she announced, "all mail for Birch Hollow Estates will be collected, inspected, and redistributed by the HOA. We need to maintain community standards and prevent inappropriate or non-conforming materials from being circulated." You could almost hear the collective heartbeat of the neighborhood skip. Rosa blinked, caught off guard. She gave a nervous laugh, thinking maybe Martha was joking. But when Martha didn't return the smile, her tone shifted. "Ma'am, I can't allow that," she said gently. "Mail handling is federal jurisdiction." That should have been the end of it. Any reasonable person would have backed off. But reason had long stopped guiding Martha Denton. Evan, still watching from his driveway, saw the transformation happen right there, the moment her authority was challenged. Her posture stiffened, her chin lifted, and her words sharpened. "You'll find," she said, tapping her clipboard like a gavel, "that this community has certain rights. We're protecting property values. Some of these deliveries are inappropriate." Rosa, patient but firm, shook her head. "The only standard here," she replied, "is federal law." It was a clash of two worlds, one built on imagined power, the other on actual authority. Rosa turned to leave, loading the remaining letters into the truck. But Martha wasn't done. She followed her, voice rising, shouting about bylaws and the integrity of Birch Hollow. Neighbors watched as she trailed behind the mail truck like a shadow that refused to disappear. There was something almost tragic about it. How a person could mistake control for purpose. How ego could masquerade as civic duty. When Evan drove by the Oak Ridge post office an hour later, he saw the same plastic bins stacked on a dolly near the entrance. Martha had followed Rosa all the way there. The situation had become surreal. Inside the building, fluorescent lights hummed overhead, slicing the tension into pieces. Customers froze mid-transaction, sensing something unnatural unfolding. Martha wheeled her bins to the counter and declared, "I'll be pre-sorting the Birch Hollow mail before it's released for delivery." Her voice carried the brittle confidence of someone used to obedience, not opposition. Postmaster Elliot Chambers emerged from the back office, a tall, calm man with the kind of presence that didn't need volume to command attention. 30 years in service had etched patience into his posture. He didn't rush toward the chaos. He simply walked, slow and deliberate, toward the counter. "Ma'am," he said evenly, "you'll need to step away from that mail." Martha turned, indignant. "And who exactly are you?" she snapped. The room seemed to hold its breath. Elliot didn't raise his voice. He didn't match her anger. Instead, he pointed to the flag hanging behind the counter. "You're looking at it," he said. It wasn't arrogance, it was conviction. The kind that comes from knowing where your authority begins and ends. For the first time, Martha hesitated. But hesitation wasn't surrender. She straightened her blazer, muttering something about her rights as a community representative. Elliot met her words with stillness. "This isn't your community," he said quietly. "This is the United States Postal Service." The distinction landed heavy. It was the first real crack in her armor. Power built on fear will always falter when it meets power built on principle. When she realized she couldn't intimidate him, her voice faltered, wobbling between indignation and desperation. "I demand to speak to your superior," she insisted. Elliot didn't flinch. "Ma'am," he said, "you're already doing that." Then, without breaking eye contact, he reached for the metal switch beneath the counter. With a resounding clank, the steel shutter slid down, locking everyone inside. The sound echoed like a verdict. The crowd fell silent. You could feel it. That moment when chaos meets consequence. Martha's face drained of color. The fluorescent lights flickered slightly, catching the edge of the flag above them. Evan would later describe it as the moment reality finally caught up with her imagination. The moment when a self-appointed queen discovered her kingdom had boundaries, after all. There's a silence that doesn't feel peaceful. It feels electric, like the air before lightning strikes. That's what filled the Oak Ridge post office after the metal shutter clanged shut. People weren't sure what they were witnessing. On one side of the counter stood Postmaster Elliot Chambers, calm as a mountain. On the other stood Martha Denton, trembling with fury and entitlement, clutching her clipboard like it was a weapon. The line between authority and arrogance had vanished, and everyone in that room could sense it. Elliot gave her 3 chances, 3 calm, measured opportunities to back away. "Ma'am," he said the first time, "step aside. You are interfering with the delivery of U.S. mail." It was less a warning and more an invitation to return to sanity. She didn't move. The second time, his voice grew firmer. "You are committing a federal offense." Still, Martha stood rooted to the floor, gripping the edge of the mail cart as though it was proof of her dominion. The third time, his tone dropped an octave, final and immovable. "This is your last warning." There was no anger in his voice, just the quiet weight of law-meeting defiance. But power doesn't always recognize limits when it's used to obedience. Martha's lips tightened, and she quoted from her clipboard, something about a clause in the HOA bylaws authorizing inspection of delivered materials. You could almost feel the room tilt in disbelief. Bylaws? Against federal law? It was absurd, and yet she believed it. Her authority had lived unchecked for so long that she genuinely thought paper rules written in a community binder could outweigh the Constitution itself. It wasn't just arrogance, it was delusion, born of never being told no. Around her, the small crowd of residents shifted uncomfortably. Some whispered, others pulled out their phones, unsure whether they were witnessing a crime or a spectacle. Rosa Martinez stood near the counter, her hands shaking. Not from fear, but from frustration. She'd seen rude customers before, but never someone who tried to hijack the mail system. Her instincts told her to start recording, and she did. The camera clicked on just in time to capture the moment everything broke. Then, from the back of the room, a soft voice cut through the tension. "Excuse me," said Mrs. Patel, her hands wringing the strap of her purse. She was a small woman, kind eyes framed by exhaustion. "I'm expecting my husband's medication. It was supposed to arrive today. It's for his heart." She looked at the stack of bins Martha guarded like a dragon hoarding treasure. "Is it in there?" The room held its breath. It was no longer about pride or procedure. It was about life. But Martha didn't even blink. "All mail will be logged before distribution," she said, her voice cool and clipped. "You'll receive it once it's cleared." That sentence, so casual, so devoid of empathy, changed everything. It was like a switch had been flipped in the crowd's collective conscience. Irritation became outrage, the kind that bubbles up when you realize someone's authority has turned into cruelty. You could see it in Rosa's expression, in the clenched fists of the man by the door, in the trembling lip of Mrs. Patel. It wasn't about an HOA anymore. It was about decency, about humanity. Elliot stepped forward again, slow and deliberate, placing himself between Martha and the mail bins. "That delivery contains critical medication," he said. "You are endangering someone's health." Martha laughed, a brittle sound. "Oh, please. You're overreacting. These people will get their mail once I'm done sorting it." Her words were hollow, but her defiance was real. In that instant, she wasn't protecting a neighborhood. She was protecting her ego. Elliot didn't raise his voice. He simply took one step closer, his shadow falling over the clipboard she clutched. "Step aside," he said quietly. But Martha blocked him, her body angled defensively, arms spread as if she could physically hold back the U.S. government. It was instinctive, desperate, a person trying to maintain a crumbling illusion of power. The moment her shoulder brushed against his uniform, the spell broke. Gasps rippled through the room. Rosa's phone captured it all. The shove, the startled look, the realization. For the first time, Martha seemed to grasp what she'd done. She'd crossed from arrogance into illegality, from nuisance into federal crime. The tension in her face faltered. She glanced around as if expecting someone, anyone, to side with her. But the crowd's eyes had turned cold. Authority had shifted. The woman who once ruled over mailbox paint colors now stood alone, face to face with the full weight of the law. Elliot didn't gloat, didn't smirk. He simply straightened his posture and said, "Ma'am, you've just committed assault on a federal employee." His words were steady as granite, carrying more power than any HOA bylaw ever could. For a moment, the only sound was the faint hum of the fluorescent lights and the rapid tapping of Rosa's phone as she captured every second. Martha opened her mouth to argue, but no words came. The clipboard slipped slightly in her grip. You could see the realization settling in. The dawning horror of someone who had mistaken fear for respect and control for competence. The silence of the crowd pressed down on her like judgment. Mrs. Patel's voice trembled again, this time sharper. "You could have killed my husband," she said. That sentence didn't accuse, it condemned. And it was the truth that broke Martha's composure completely. Elliot reached for his radio. His voice was calm as ever, but there was finality in it. "This is Postmaster Chambers at Oak Ridge. I'm reporting interference with U.S. mail and assault on a postal employee. We'll need inspectors on site." The words hung heavy in the air. Nobody moved. Rosa lowered her phone slowly, her recording still running, ensuring there would be no rewriting of history this time. Evan, standing near the door, later described the moment as the sound of authority imploding. The same woman who once terrified the neighborhood now stood cornered by the very system she'd tried to manipulate. Every false claim, every rule she'd bent to feed her ego, was now irrelevant. The law doesn't care about titles, committees, or HOA bylaws. It only recognizes truth. As the sirens began to echo faintly in the distance, the crowd parted. Martha stayed frozen, her confidence draining away like air from a punctured balloon. Rosa's camera caught her face perfectly. The shift from indignation to disbelief to fear. It was the kind of silence that teaches a lesson without needing words. When power forgets compassion, it becomes its own punishment. And in that small-town post office, surrounded by witnesses and the hum of fluorescent lights, Martha Denton learned that lesson the hardest way possible. There's a kind of silence that doesn't come from peace. It comes from inevitability. That was the air inside the Oak Ridge post office after Postmaster Elliot Chambers made his announcement. "Postal inspectors are on their way. Until they arrive, no one leaves." His voice wasn't loud, but it carried the kind of weight that didn't need volume. It wasn't a threat. It was the sound of rules finally reclaiming their ground. Every person in that room felt it. The shift in gravity when real authority steps forward and chaos runs out of breath. Martha Denton tried to laugh it off. It was the brittle kind of laugh you hear when someone realizes they've lost control but still thinks charm might fix it. "This is ridiculous," she said, gesturing to the locked door. "You can't keep us here." But her words landed like paper darts against stone. Elliot didn't even look up from his logbook. He was calm, methodical, writing down the time, the witnesses, the chain of events. He wasn't arguing. He was documenting. And that difference mattered, because when someone argues, they're uncertain. When someone documents, they're already building the record for justice. The room had transformed without anyone realizing it. It wasn't a post office anymore, it was a courtroom. Every witness, every sound, every detail was evidence now. You could feel the unspoken understanding ripple through the crowd. Phones were out, recording silently. Even those who'd come in just to mail a package now stood rooted, unwilling to miss what they knew was a turning point. For years, Martha Denton had played queen in a kingdom of mailboxes, dictating what was proper and who was compliant. But in this fluorescent-lit space, her authority evaporated. Here, her crown didn't matter. Rosa Martinez stood near the counter, still holding her phone steady, her hands trembling just slightly from the adrenaline. She wasn't afraid anymore. She was focused. Every second was being preserved. Every word, every gesture. Elliot's composure made it easier for everyone else to breathe. There's something magnetic about calmness under pressure. It makes chaos look smaller. And that's what Elliot embodied. A quiet refusal to be intimidated. Martha, however, couldn't stand still. Her face was flushed, her movements sharp and erratic, like someone trying to shake off the feeling of losing control. "You don't understand," she shouted. "I have the right to oversee community property. These deliveries affect the entire neighborhood." The words rang hollow. No one answered. The silence was more powerful than any argument. Even those who might have once feared her now watched her with detachment, as though seeing her clearly for the first time. Then it happened. The moment the tension snapped. A young clerk, barely 19, tried to move one of the mail bins away from her reach, following Chambers' quiet instruction. It was a simple act, almost gentle. But Martha reacted like a cornered animal. "Don't touch that!" she screamed, and before anyone could react, She shoved him. Hard. The impact wasn't violent, but it was deliberate. The clerk stumbled backward into the wall of P.O. boxes, his expression stunned, more confused than hurt. But that single movement changed everything. Elliot looked up slowly, his expression unreadable. He didn't rush forward. He didn't raise his voice. He simply said the words that carried centuries of institutional gravity. "That's assault on a federal employee." And just like that, the entire room froze. The authority in his voice didn't come from ego, it came from structure, from the kind of system built to withstand people like Martha Denton. The words echoed through the space, bouncing off metal and tile like a verdict already decided. Martha's defiance faltered. You could see her trying to think of something. Some argument, some clause, some loophole that could undo what had just happened. But there was nothing left to hide behind. The law doesn't negotiate with entitlement. Her hands trembled, and for the first time, she looked small. She stammered something about misunderstanding, about intent, but no one listened. Even the crowd, which had once been filled with murmurs, now stood in reverent silence. Because everyone understood. They had just witnessed the moment when arrogance met consequence. Minutes later, through the glass doors, the faint flash of blue lights painted the lobby in short, rhythmic bursts. The inspectors had arrived. Two of them stepped inside, uniformed, composed, carrying the calm efficiency of people who handle truth for a living. They didn't need to ask who was responsible. The witnesses had already drawn the story in their faces. Rosa handed one inspector her phone, the recording still running. Elliot gave a concise summary. Times, actions, offenses. Every fact lined up with surgical precision. Martha tried one last attempt at saving face. "This is all a misunderstanding," she pleaded, her tone softening into something almost childlike. "I was only trying to protect the neighborhood." But the words didn't hold weight anymore. Protection requires empathy, and everyone had seen how little of that she possessed. One inspector stepped closer, reciting the charges calmly. Interference with mail delivery, obstruction, and assault on a federal employee. Then came the sound that nobody forgot. The sharp, metallic click of handcuffs closing. It wasn't loud, but it was final. The sound of order reasserting itself. The crowd exhaled collectively, like a pressure valve releasing. Some people even applauded softly, not out of mockery, but out of sheer relief. Rosa lowered her phone and whispered, "It's over." Elliot gave a small nod, the kind that says justice doesn't always need celebration, it just needs completion. As Martha was escorted out, her eyes darted from face to face, searching for sympathy, for someone who still saw her as the figure of authority she once was. But nobody did. What they saw instead was a woman undone by her own hubris, a person who had mistaken power for purpose. Outside, the sunlight was blinding, unforgiving in its honesty. And in that light, the balance of things quietly reset itself. The post office returned to what it had always been, a place of order, service, and quiet dignity. But for those who had been there, it would never be just another day. They had seen something rare. The exact moment when justice stopped being theoretical and became visible, audible, undeniable. The moment a single click echoed louder than years of unchecked authority. Most people thought it was over the moment Martha Denton was led out of the Oak Ridge post office in handcuffs. For the crowd that had gathered, justice had already been served. They'd seen arrogance collapse, watched entitlement meet accountability, and for the first time in years, the air in Birch Hollow Estates felt lighter. But the truth, like most truths, didn't stop at what people saw. It went deeper, quieter, buried beneath paperwork and signatures, and it was about to unravel into something far darker than anyone imagined. When the postal inspectors began their formal review, they expected to close the case in a few days. A simple charge of mail interference, maybe an assault citation, some fines, restitution. But the evidence refused to stay simple. One of the inspectors, a man named Rohr, noticed something off in the pile of seized documents. A neatly typed form printed on HOA letterhead marked Authorization for Mail Compliance Audit. It looked official: embossed logo, stamped signature lines, even a watermark. But something didn't add up. The signatories listed didn't exist. There was no Community Oversight Subcommittee. There never had been. The deeper they looked, the clearer it became. This wasn't an overreach of authority. It was a blueprint for manipulation. Forgery is a peculiar kind of crime. It doesn't shout, it whispers. It hides behind familiarity. Most people see an official logo and never question it. But the inspectors were trained to. Cross-checking HOA filings, they found inconsistencies. Meeting minutes, referencing audits that had never occurred. Signatures that didn't match. Payments that disappeared into administrative reserves. The so-called mail compliance audit wasn't policy. It was camouflage. It was the paperwork version of a con artist's smile. And like all good cons, it was hiding a motive that hit where people least expect it. Money. Lots of it. Following the paper trail led them to a small shell company, Elmcrest Holdings, LLC, registered to a P.O. box 2 towns over. On paper, it looked harmless. But when Inspector Rohr pulled the financial records, something clicked. The company's transactions perfectly overlapped with a string of home foreclosures in Birch Hollow over the past year. Every time a family fell behind on dues or taxes, a notice went missing. Every time a house was seized, Elmcrest Holdings bought it at auction. Cheap. Effortlessly. Martha hadn't just been controlling mail, she'd been controlling information. By intercepting overdue bills, mortgage notices, and legal warnings, she created the perfect silence. The kind that ruins people before they even know they're in trouble. What the neighborhood thought was obsessive order was actually a coordinated operation to create chaos. Just the kind of chaos her brother-in-law, a local developer named Gerald Thorne, needed. His company specialized in flipping foreclosed homes, turning distressed properties into quick profit. And Martha, ever the loyal enforcer of community standards, had turned her HOA presidency into a financial weapon. Evan Cole, who had been there the day of her arrest, was stunned when the inspectors approached him for help. They'd heard he kept meticulous notes from every HOA meeting. He did. It had started as self-defense, just a habit to protect himself from fines and violations. But now, those notebooks were evidence. Evan sat at his dining table late into the night, flipping through old agendas, printed emails, and bank statements. At first, it seemed like normal bureaucracy. But then he noticed a pattern. The same 4 names approving every financial transfer, every contract, every so-called beautification project. And tucked in the margins of one meeting summary was a line that made his stomach turn. Ensure all non-compliant residents' mail is screened before renewal notices go out. It wasn't a reminder. It was a directive. There's a moment in every story where confusion becomes clarity, and clarity becomes anger. For Evan, that moment came when he realized how many lives had been quietly wrecked. The Petersons, who'd lost their home over missed HOA payments they swore they'd never seen. The retired school teacher who'd been forced to sell after her insurance renewal notice vanished. People had been humiliated, uprooted, displaced, and all of it orchestrated by a woman who claimed to be protecting the neighborhood. It was theft, wrapped in neighborly language. When Evan handed his evidence over to the inspectors, he didn't expect to be part of the investigation. But his methodical nature made him invaluable. He helped them cross-reference financial ledgers, matching outgoing checks labeled Community Outreach to deposits made in Gerald Thorne's accounts. The math told a story of its own, one that spanned 18 months and over $120,000 in diverted funds. Every payment disguised as consulting or property assessment. Every justification a lie. The hardest part wasn't proving the fraud, it was confronting the betrayal. Birch Hollow had trusted Martha. She was the kind of person who looked like order personified. Blazer pressed, rules memorized, smile rehearsed. She made people believe that control was safety. But the inspectors saw what she'd really built. A web of fear disguised as structure. A system where compliance wasn't about harmony. It was about silence. As the investigation deepened, they found the connections stretching wider. Emails between Martha and Gerald revealed coded language, phrases like timely compliance and controlled timing of notices. It was the perfect crime for a suburban stage. No violence, no headlines, just lives quietly rearranged in the name of regulation. But what makes corruption like this so devastating isn't the money. It's the trust it destroys. It teaches people that order isn't safe, that rules can be rigged, that even the systems meant to protect them can be twisted by those who crave control. Evan couldn't shake the thought. How many times had he ignored his own discomfort in the name of keeping peace? How many others had done the same? It was easier to dismiss the early warning signs, the endless memos, the overreach, the intimidation, because confronting them meant risking conflict. That's the trap of small tyrannies. They thrive in politeness. They count on silence. But once truth starts speaking, even quietly, power starts to unravel. When the inspectors finally presented their findings to federal prosecutors, the full scope stunned everyone. Martha's mail compliance scheme wasn't an isolated act. It was a coordinated fraud ring that turned a neighborhood into an extraction machine. She hadn't been protecting property values. She'd been mining them. And now, the same federal system she'd mocked would decide her fate. For the residents of Birch Hollow, it was a strange kind of relief. The pieces finally made sense. The missing letters, the unexplained fines, the sudden foreclosures. And yet, the victory felt heavy, because it forced them to see something uncomfortable about themselves, that they'd given away their power one compliance notice at a time. Evan said it best when speaking with the inspectors afterward. We trusted her because she looked like order. But real order doesn't demand fear. It earns respect. That line stuck with everyone who heard it. Because deep down, it wasn't just about an HOA president gone rogue. It was about every person who's ever been told to stay quiet for the good of the community. And as the inspectors packed up the files, one of them turned to Evan and said, almost thoughtfully, "Funny thing about people like her, they build systems so tight, they forget they can strangle themselves with them." It wasn't triumph. It was truth. And it carried the quiet kind of justice that lasts longer than outrage ever could. Justice doesn't always arrive with fanfare. Sometimes it walks in quietly, wearing a judge's robe and holding a stack of evidence that speaks louder than any defense ever could. That's how it felt the morning of Martha Denton's federal hearing. The courtroom wasn't dramatic or cinematic. It was calm, almost sterile. But beneath that stillness, there was a sense of inevitability, like everyone already knew how this story would end. The judge, a man known for his dry humor and razor-sharp logic, began by recounting the absurdity of it all. An HOA president, he said, glancing at the stack of exhibits, who believed she had jurisdiction over the United States Postal Service. There was a slight chuckle from the gallery. Even the court reporter looked like she was trying not to smirk. But the judge's expression didn't change. "We are here," he continued, "because someone mistook control for leadership and law for preference." The words landed like stones dropped into a still pond, each one rippling further than the last. Martha sat at the defense table, her posture stiff, her blazer a shade too formal for the setting. Her lawyer, a man doing his best with the impossible, argued for leniency. This was a misunderstanding, he claimed. A community dispute that spiraled out of control. Mrs. Denton's intentions were not criminal. They were protective. He emphasized that word, as if repackaging manipulation as concern might soften the edges. But the evidence on the screens behind him told a different story. Video footage showed Martha shouting in the post office, blocking the mail bins, pushing the young clerk. Photographs displayed the forged HOA letterhead. Bank transfers linked her to shell accounts. Every exhibit stripped away another layer of pretense until all that remained was the truth. Simple, undeniable, and deeply unflattering. The judge didn't need to raise his voice. He just looked at her and said, "Intent doesn't erase impact." That line cut through the courtroom like wind through glass. There's something sobering about watching a person realize the walls they built to protect their image are now the very things closing in on them. Martha's face didn't crumble all at once. It fractured slowly, in pieces. The confident tilt of her chin lowered. The tight grip on her pen loosened. Even her voice, once sharp enough to slice through silence, was gone. She wasn't a leader anymore. She was a lesson. When the time came for sentencing, the judge didn't rush. He listed every offense: mail interference, forgery, fraud, and assault on a federal employee. And with each one, the courtroom seemed to exhale a little more. Then came the restitution order, repayment of every stolen dollar, every falsified transaction, plus interest. It wasn't just financial, it was symbolic. A public reckoning measured down to the cent. But the most poetic part wasn't the money. It was what came next. The judge leaned back, almost contemplative, and said, "Given the nature of your actions, I think it's fitting that your community service reflects the institution you disrespected." A pause. "You will serve 400 hours at the Oak Ridge Post Office under the supervision of Postmaster Chambers." There was an audible stir in the courtroom. Even the bailiff's eyebrows lifted. Martha's head snapped up, disbelief flashing across her face. The same building where she'd demanded power was now her workplace. The same man she'd tried to intimidate would now be her superior. It wasn't cruelty. It was symmetry. Justice, shaped like irony. Evan Cole would later describe seeing her there for the first time. It was a few weeks after the sentencing. He'd gone to the post office to mail some paperwork and noticed a woman in a plain gray uniform scrubbing the tile floor near the entrance. She moved slowly, methodically, head down. When she straightened up to wring out the mop, he recognized her. Martha Denton? No clipboard, no authority, no audience. Just quiet labor under the hum of fluorescent lights. And there, standing behind the counter, was Postmaster Chambers, reviewing letters like nothing had changed at all. Evan said he didn't feel gloating, just a strange calm. Watching her work wasn't about humiliation, it was about balance. For once, things in Birch Hollow made sense. The system had bent, but it hadn't broken. The law had spoken without cruelty, and order had been restored in the way it was always meant to be, through accountability, not fear. Weeks later, as word spread through the neighborhood, the story became legend. People whispered about it, not with anger anymore, but with relief. There was laughter, gentle, knowing laughter, at the sheer irony of it all. The woman who once claimed dominion over every mailbox now couldn't come within 25 feet of one without supervision. It was poetic justice in its purest form, the kind that writes itself into local folklore. And if you were to walk past the Oak Ridge Post Office on a quiet morning, you might see her there, cleaning, sorting, quietly existing in the shadow of the very flag she once challenged. It wasn't vengeance, it was transformation. Because sometimes the most fitting justice doesn't destroy someone, it humbles them back into humanity. Change doesn't always happen in grand gestures. Sometimes it arrives quietly, like a soft wind after a long storm, touching everything it passes without demanding recognition. That's how it felt in Birch Hollow Estates after the dust settled. The shouting had stopped, the fear had lifted, and what replaced it wasn't triumph, but relief. Real, steady relief, the kind that comes when people finally exhale after holding their breath for far too long. Evan Cole would often walk through the neighborhood in those first few weeks, noticing how different the air felt. The same houses stood in the same perfect rows. The same mailboxes lined the curbs. But there was something new in the rhythm of it all. Laughter where there used to be whispers. Conversations on porches that used to be cut short when certain footsteps approached. Neighbors who used to nod stiffly now stopped to talk, as if rediscovering what it meant to belong to a community instead of an empire. It wasn't the streets that had changed, it was the people. The new HOA board wasted no time rebuilding what had been broken. Arthur Williams, the quiet librarian who'd once avoided conflict, was unanimously elected as the new president. He didn't campaign. He didn't posture. He simply promised honesty. Under his leadership, the rules stayed, but their purpose changed. Transparency became policy, not decoration. Term limits were introduced so no one could ever wield indefinite power again. Meetings moved from lecture halls to living rooms, where everyone had a seat and a say. For the first time in years, Birch Hollow didn't sound like an organization. It sounded like a neighborhood. Evan often thought about how fragile peace really was. It wasn't just about removing one person. It was about unlearning the habits that let her reign in the first place. People had tolerated her control because it was easier than confrontation, because they confused order with safety. But now they understood that true order isn't about control. It's about balance. The kind that allows both individuality and unity to exist side by side. Birch Hollow had become its own kind of classroom, teaching the quiet lesson that fear disguised as structure is still fear. One afternoon, Evan visited the post office to drop off a package. The same Oak Ridge building that had once held so much tension now felt different. Lighter. The staff smiled more. The air buzzed with the easy rhythm of normal life. And there, near the entrance, stood Postmaster Elliot Chambers, with a paint roller in hand. The smell of fresh paint filled the air. Evan stopped to watch as Chambers carefully measured a circle around the community mailbox. A perfect, unbroken ring of bright yellow. 25 feet wide, it wasn't just paint. It was a message. Elliot looked up and caught Evan watching, offering a small, knowing smile. "Boundaries," he said simply, tapping the roller against the rim of the paint can. "They keep things working right." Then he went back to painting. The sound of the roller moving across concrete was steady, deliberate, almost ceremonial. It was the sound of a line being drawn not just in the physical world but in memory, a line between what the neighborhood had been and what it had become. Evan stood there for a while, realizing that this was more than just symbolic. It was the closure everyone needed, a visible reminder that peace isn't passive. It has to be protected. That yellow circle wasn't about exclusion. It was about respect, a declaration that no one, no matter how important they believed themselves to be, could ever again claim ownership over something that belonged to everyone. Later that evening, as the sun dipped low and the light caught the fresh yellow paint, Evan felt something shift inside him. He thought about the people who'd moved here chasing safety, and how easily safety can be mistaken for control. He thought about how small acts, speaking up, asking questions, refusing to comply blindly, had changed everything. The neighborhood had found its courage again, not through rebellion, but through honesty. He often said that the real victory wasn't in watching Martha Denton fall. It was in watching his community rise. They didn't just rebuild, they remembered. They remembered that leadership isn't about power, it's about service. That laws mean nothing without fairness. That peace doesn't come from silence. It comes from accountability. And maybe that's the truest kind of justice there is. Not vengeance, not punishment, but renewal. The next morning, children rode their bikes around that yellow circle, their laughter echoing through the air. Dogs barked. Someone waved from across the street. And for the first time in a long time, Birch Hollow Estates felt alive again. That ring of paint, bright against the concrete, would fade over the years, but the lesson behind it wouldn't. Because sometimes the simplest boundaries the ones drawn with humility instead of authority, become the strongest guardrails against chaos. And in that small, sunlit circle around a mailbox, the people of Birch Hollow had reclaimed something they hadn't even realized they'd lost: their freedom to just live, peacefully and unafraid. Months later, Evan found himself back at the Oak Ridge post office on an ordinary Tuesday morning. The air smelled faintly of disinfectant and paper. Familiar, clean, unremarkable. He stood in line, waiting to mail a small package, when a quiet sound caught his attention: the rhythmic squeak of a mop gliding over tile. He turned, and there she was, Martha Denton, dressed in gray work clothes, hair pulled back, moving slowly but deliberately as she cleaned the floor near the mail slots. For a moment, Evan almost didn't recognize her. Gone was the stiff posture, the polished blazer, the sharp eyes that once scanned for imperfection. What stood before him wasn't the HOA president who ruled through fear. It was simply a woman doing her job. When their eyes met, she froze for half a second, as if bracing for judgment. But Evan just smiled and nodded. To his surprise, she smiled back, small and sincere. "Morning," she said softly. "How's the neighborhood?" Her tone carried no trace of command, just humility. It was the kind of greeting that expected nothing in return. From behind the counter, Rosa grinned. "You know," she said, wiping her hands on a rag, "she's our best floor tech now. Never misses a spot." The lightness in her voice made everyone laugh. Even Martha chuckled, shaking her head with quiet acceptance. And in that laughter, the weight of everything that had happened seemed to dissolve. There was no bitterness, no awkwardness, only an odd, unexpected peace. Evan left the post office that day with a strange sense of closure. Not the dramatic kind, but the kind that lingers. Soft, reflective, human. He realized that sometimes justice doesn't end in punishment. It ends in understanding. Power had once consumed Martha, but humility had set her free. She no longer needed control to feel relevant. And as Evan stepped into the sunlight, he couldn't help but think that maybe, in her own quiet way, she'd finally found what she'd been chasing all along: order, not in the world around her, but within herself.